She solved countless murders, but this one she buried in silence. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now let's uncover her secret. The morning fog still clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, like a memory reluctant to fade, as Miss Marple settled herself in the vicarage drawing-room, the fire crackling politely behind her. She sipped her tea with mild satisfaction, the way she always did after completing her crossword. Outside, the quiet village ticked along with its usual rhythm, postman grumbling at his bicycle, sparrows chattering in the ivy. But that peace was soon to be shattered by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing," he said, stepping in with the sort of face one wears only for funerals or confessions. "My dear boy, you look rather pale. Do sit."
"Down, and do tell me, what is it?" He didn't sit.
Instead, he held out a small, sealed envelope. This was found in a locked writing desk. The contents, well, I think you should read it. Miss Marple took the letter, noticing the handwriting first, an elegant slant she had seen before. It was addressed to no one in particular, unsigned and unsealed. She unfolded it slowly. If you're reading this, it means I've failed to keep the truth buried. "The woman I killed did not deserve it. Her name was Alice Carruthers, and I killed her in 1947. The body is buried beneath the rose garden in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple stared at the words as the blood drained from her face. "Alice Carruthers," she repeated, voice barely above a whisper. But she disappeared decades ago. No trace, no clue. We all thought she had simply run off with that dreadful artist. "Are you telling me someone confessed?" Craddock nodded gravely. "Her disappearance was never properly classified as foul play. There was no body, no sign of struggle, no known enemies. But the gardener dug up the northeast corner of the vicarage garden yesterday for replanting, found skeletal remains beneath the soil. The letter was discovered among a box of old papers in the attic. Same house, all this time." The room seemed colder now, despite the fire. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowed. "The letter? No name, no date, no way to confirm its author?" "No, but we suspect it might be Eleanor Wren. She lived in the house after the war until her death last winter. She never—"
"Married, no family, a bit of a recluse." "I remember Eleanor," said Miss Marple, "very quiet, always trimming her hedges when no one was looking, always watching from windows but never inviting anyone in. And she rented the vicarage after the war. How strange. But she was not the sort to kill, not at all." "Then perhaps someone wanted us to think she was," Craddock said.
"Which is why I came to you." Miss Marple did not smile at that. She only looked down at the paper again. "That rose garden," she said. "I remember when it was planted. But it wasn't Eleanor who had it installed. It was the previous tenant."
"Lydia and Harold Carruthers," Craddock blinked. "Carruthers?"
"Yes," Miss Marple said slowly. "Harold was Alice's older brother." The connection hung in the air like the thick scent of roses. Craddock exhaled and pulled out a small black notebook. "We've started looking into the Carruthers family, but records from that period are scattered. Would you mind walking me through what you remember?" Miss Marple, her mind already dancing through distant memories, nodded. Alice was a spirited girl, rather too modern for her own good always, chasing excitement. She arrived in St. Mary Mead in 1946 to stay with Harold and his wife Lydia. Rumour had it she was recovering from a failed affair in London, some scandal involving a married man. She was the sort who drew eyes and stirred opinions, but I wouldn't. Call her cruel, lonely perhaps. She paused, eyes narrowing in thought. And then one day She was simply gone. Craddock flipped pages in his notebook. The official account said she left on the 2:15 train for Southampton. Several villagers thought they saw her that morning. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, but none of them spoke to her directly. They saw a woman in her coat from behind. That always struck me as too convenient. Meaning someone could have impersonated her, Craddock said, or ensured no one ever saw her leave at all. Miss Marple stood up abruptly, startling the inspector. I should like to visit the old Carruthers house, the vicarage, may we? 10 minutes later, they were standing beneath grey skies at the overgrown gate of the once elegant cottage. The house had been sold and resold over the years, but the garden still bore the faded remnants of old rose beds. Miss Marple walked slowly along the edge, her eyes on the uneven ground. There, she said, pointing to a sunken spot in the soil. That wasn't always there. That's where the remains were found. She crouched, despite Craddock's protests, and brushed her gloved hand along the dirt. Rose bushes don't grow this well without something nourishing the roots.
How gruesome, and yet how clever. They moved inside. The house smelled of dust and age. Craddock guided her upstairs to the attic room where the letter was found. It was sparse, just an old writing desk and some broken chairs. Miss Marple
opened the drawer. Was this locked when discovered? Yes. Took us half an hour to force it open. But Eleanor Wren didn't own the desk, Miss Marple said. It belonged to Lydia. I remember that distinctly. She had it delivered.
From London! Carved mahogany. She was terribly proud of it. Craddock frowned. So why was it still here when the Carruthers moved out?
Miss Marple stood, her face pale. Because Lydia never moved out. Harold did. After the disappearance, he remarried and left the village, but Lydia? She vanished not long after Alice. I always assumed she followed her husband later, but
no. What if the body isn't Alice's? Craddock's eyes widened. You think the skeleton might be Lydia Carruthers? Miss Marple nodded slowly. Alice may have survived.
It would explain why no one ever saw her after that day, yet the house remained occupied. What if she killed Lydia and took her place? Silence filled the attic like rising water. She had the same figure, Miss Marple whispered. Wore
Lydia's clothes, played the part for a while until Harold left her. Then she stayed, alone, living as Lydia, hiding in plain sight.
She was the one who became Eleanor Wren, changed her name just enough, reclusive, solitary, but still very much alive. Craddock looked stunned. And the letter? A final confession? Yes. Guilt can bloom even in the hardest soil, and it seems Miss Alice Carruthers, living as Eleanor Wren, chose to write it before she died. Perhaps she knew the garden would eventually reveal her secret. Craddock stared down at the letter again. Then we've had it all backwards. Alice was never the victim. No, Miss Marple said softly. She was the murderer. And for nearly 40 years she lived in the house of the woman she killed. They stood in the attic, the shadows, around them colder than before. Outside, the roses rustled softly in the wind, as if whispering the truth she had hidden for years. The next morning arrived with the kind of brittle light only a chill August dawn in St. Mary Mead could bring. The village stirred, quietly abuzz with the whisper of murder, not the usual topic over breakfast marmalade, but inside the vicarage-turned-crime scene, the air was still and tense. Miss Marple arrived just as the forensic team finished cataloguing the remains. Inspector Craddock was already inside, standing stiffly beside the body bag, as if proximity to the truth might force it to reveal itself. She was living as Lydia, Craddock muttered, barely acknowledging Miss Marple's presence. And all this time everyone believed Lydia had simply left. She did leave, Miss Marple replied gently. Only not the way anyone thought. But as she glanced about the sitting room, something tugged at her attention. A dissonance, a hair out of place in an otherwise composed portrait. The old writing desk had been taken in for examination, but in its place stood a small bookshelf against the east wall. Odd. The furniture layout had changed slightly since the last time she visited the house many years ago. The previous arrangement had included a wing-back chair by the window, now gone. She moved slowly toward the bookshelf and crouched slightly to inspect the floor. Dust had settled in fine layers across the wooden boards, but in a small patch near the wall, the dust pattern was broken, slight scuff marks, as though something heavy had been dragged and replaced badly. Craddock noticed her pause. What is it? This shelf, she said, tapping its side gently. It hasn't always stood here, and the dust suggests it was moved recently, within months, not years. The inspector frowned and stepped over. A bookshelf hiding something seems a bit dramatic. Dramatic, yes, she murmured, running a fingertip along the inside edge. But murder often is. With a bit of effort, Craddock pulled the shelf aside. Behind it, the wallpaper was newer, patched in a square that didn't match the rest of the wall. Different print, subtly different shade. Miss Marple pressed her hand to the patch, and it gave slightly under her fingers. A false panel. Craddock slid his penknife between the seams and popped the panel open. Inside was a narrow cavity, just large enough to hold a bundle of letters, tied with red twine. He pulled them out carefully. Each was addressed to my dearest, Harold, dated between July and November of 1947, months after Alice Carruthers had supposedly disappeared. Craddock laid them out on the dining table as Miss Marple read the first few lines. Harold, I cannot continue this pretense. Every time I speak in her voice, wear her clothes, I feel the weight grow heavier. But I love you more than you know, and this was the only way. She would have taken you from me, she nearly did. Forgive me. I buried her among the roses. You must never dig there, trust me, always. Miss Marple blinked slowly. So she wasn't trying to confess. These weren't meant for anyone but Harold. Craddock ran a hand over his jaw. Which means Harold knew, or at least suspected. Perhaps. Or perhaps she never sent them. Perhaps she wrote them only to unburden herself, sealing them away. There was a sudden knock at the front door. Craddock turned to answer, but Miss Marple held up a hand. No need, she said, already recognizing the firm footsteps and the smell of wool and tobacco that entered with the man now crossing the threshold. Detective Chief Superintendent
Adam Northcote, he announced in a dry tone, flashing credentials as he stepped into the room. Called in from division. Sorry to intrude on the local operation, but this case raised eyebrows in London.
Missing woman, secret identity, a decades-old corpse buried beneath an English rose garden. It reads like a pulp novel. Craddock muttered a half-hearted greeting. Miss Marple simply nodded. Northcote removed his gloves with the efficiency of a man used to disassembling truths for a living. He took in the scene with narrowed eyes and moved toward the stack of letters, reading the top one in silence. Fascinating, he finally said, tapping the parchment. But people lie in love letters more than in courtrooms. These tell us motive, perhaps, but not the full truth. He circled the room with deliberate steps, his gaze scanning the details others might overlook. He paused by the fireplace, then knelt to inspect the iron poker resting in its stand. Miss Marple, he said without looking up, was this poker always here? I couldn't say with certainty, but I believe so. Lydia was fond of the fire, even in summer. Odd, he muttered. This is an old poker, Victorian, judging by the wrought iron detail, but it's pristine, not a speck of soot. It's been cleaned recently, aggressively. Craddock blinked. You think it was used as a weapon? Possibly. But more curiously, Northcote added, standing and holding the poker horizontally, it's slightly bent, the sort of bend you'd see from impact, a blunt strike, very old, possibly from years ago. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. If she used this to kill Lydia, then she kept it all these years. Not as a tool, but as a memory. A guilty one, Craddock added. Or a trophy, Northcote said. Killer psychology runs the spectrum. He moved to the mantel and inspected a porcelain clock, still ticking. He lifted it gently, noting the faint indentation it had made in the dust beneath it. And yet, he murmured, for all this fuss, something's missing. Miss Marple turned. What do you mean? This house has no photographs, no portraits.
Not a single one. Craddock looked around. He's right. Not even a wedding photo.
Because she couldn't risk anyone recognizing her, Miss Marple said. Even as an old woman, Alice was always beautiful, striking. A picture of Lydia hanging in plain sight would invite questions if a former friend or visitor recognized
her. So she removed them? Hid her face from history. Northcote nodded slowly. She spent the rest of her life erasing the woman she murdered.
Craddock folded his arms. So what now? Northcote gestured toward the letters. We run handwriting analysis, confirm authorship. We identify the remains properly, dental records if they exist, bone forensics. But you've built a strong case already, and I'll admit, this is the most elegant murder I've seen hidden in a rose garden. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but there was no satisfaction in it. Evil is rarely elegant, Mr. Northcote, she said. It merely wears the
mask of cleverness, but it always rots beneath. They stood in silence for a moment, three minds orbiting the same unsolved truth.
The real question still hung in the air. What happened in that house in 1947 exactly, and who else might have known? Because as Miss Marple turned toward the open door, she noticed something odd. Just outside the gate stood a woman, mid-60s, dressed in beige, holding a hat in both hands. Watching. She had been there for some time. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Craddock, she said softly. Who lives across the lane? No one you'd remember, he said. Just a Mrs. Finch, moved in a few years ago. Miss Marple kept watching the figure. She's not new to this village. That's Dora Blackwell, and she was Alice Carruthers' closest friend. And just like that, the next thread in the tapestry revealed itself. Ask ChatGPT Craddock arranged the interviews in the old drawing room, the one that still smelled faintly of dust and dried rose petals. The body had been removed, the letters sealed in evidence bags, and yet the walls seemed to hum with the echoes of long-buried truths. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a high-backed chair near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly. Less a hobby now than a disguise for a mind as sharp as any scalpel. The first to be questioned was Dora Blackwell. She stepped in slowly, the beige coat clutched tightly around her middle despite the warmth of the room. Her eyes darted across the space, resting for a moment on the empty hearth, then on Miss Marple. Her expression flickered, recognition and unease in equal measure. I didn't expect to be pulled into this, she said quickly, her voice thin, as if trained by years of polite denial. I haven't spoken to Alice, well, Eleanor, I suppose, for decades. But you knew her, Craddock said gently. Before she came to St. Mary Mead. Yes, Dora replied, perching carefully on the edge of the armchair. We met during the war. She was a magnetic person, you understand? Not always easy, but unforgettable. Miss Marple's eyes never left her needles. And when she came to stay with Harold and Lydia Carruthers, Craddock prompted. Dora hesitated. I thought it was strange. She said she needed a place to start over. She was always running from something. And you visited her here a few times? Once in 47, once more, I think, in 48.
After that, well, we lost touch. And did you ever meet Lydia? Dora's smile faltered. Of course. Briefly. I found her a little distant. Cold, perhaps. Not what I expected from Alice's letters. Alice's letters? Craddock
repeated. I mean Eleanor's, Dora corrected too quickly. Miss Marple finally looked up. Forgive me, Mrs. Blackwell, but which name did she use in the letters you received after 1947? Dora froze. There were only a few, she said carefully. She signed them E. I assumed it was a nickname. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression softened, the way it always did when she sensed fear, not guilt. Thank you, Craddock said, closing his notebook. We may speak again. Dora left the room swiftly, but not before glancing once more at the fireplace. Not at the poker, but at the painting above it. Miss Marple noted that with care. The next visitor was young Martin Welland, a local handyman, who had worked for Eleanor Wren in her final years. He arrived with his cap in hand and a scuff of dirt still on his boots. She was odd, the old lady, he said without being asked. Always watching the street from her upstairs window. Never let me inside the house unless she was in the room. Did she ever mention her past? Craddock asked. Not really. She had a lot of old books, some fancy London stuff, books about art and psychology. Didn't strike me as local. Did she ever mention Lydia Carruthers? Well, Martin scratched his chin. Only once. I was fixing the trellis last summer and I made a joke about how roses like secrets. She froze up. Told me never to mention Lydia again, said she was better off gone. I thought she meant dead, but maybe not. Craddock wrote something down. Did she ever talk about Harold Carruthers? No, I didn't know she'd even
had a brother. Craddock paused, then nodded. You may go. Martin left with a polite tip of the head, but his last words had lodged themselves in Miss Marple's mind. Better off gone. It was a curious turn of phrase, something a guilty person might say, or someone mourning a long-lost friend. Next came a woman named Mrs. Portley, white gloves, stern mouth, and the voice of someone who had judged the village from behind lace curtains for decades. I never trusted her, she declared, before even sitting down. Eleanor, Lydia, whoever she was. You believe she wasn't who she claimed to be? Craddock asked, interested. I don't believe, Inspector. I know. I told the constable back in 1947 that Alice Carruthers never boarded that train. I was at the station, saw everything. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting paused mid-stitch. She was wearing a blue coat, wasn't she? She asked, gently. Mrs. Portley's eyes flashed. Yes, she was, but her walk was different, slower, hesitant. I thought she might be ill. But now I think it wasn't Alice at all. Could it have been Lydia pretending to be Alice? Craddock asked. Mrs. Portley sniffed. Could have been a mannequin for all the interest anyone showed. No one spoke to her. That's the problem. Everyone saw, but no one looked. After she left, Northcote entered from the hallway, arms folded. She's self-important, but she might be right. That blue coat's come up in 2 accounts now. We should try to trace it. Or what remains of it, Miss Marple added. Craddock sighed. Let's not forget Harold. He's still alive. Lives in Surrey. Retired. Should we? Miss Marple interrupted softly. Wait. She stared at the letters again, still laid out on the table under a sheet of glass. I think we're circling the truth, but someone's pushing us subtly.
Away from it. These testimonies, they're fragmented, incomplete. Each person is telling part of the story, but no one speaks of the moment the truth was decided, the night Alice disappeared. Craddock frowned. What are you getting at? The stories don't fit together, she said. They don't overlap naturally. Mrs. Portley claims Alice, or someone in her coat, left on the train. Dora says she received letters from
Eleanor after that date. Martin says Eleanor reacted to Lydia's name with dread. And the poker, cleaned yet old damage. Northcote's brow creased. So we're missing someone? No, Miss Marple said quietly. We're missing a lie, a big one told so well, so carefully, it has shaped every recollection around it.
She turned toward the hallway. Dora Blackwell knows more than she told us, not just about Alice, but about what really happened that summer. And I think she was there the night Lydia died. Craddock straightened. You're sure? I'm as sure she never stopped looking at the painting above the fireplace, and I'm sure she knew Alice, really knew her, enough to recognize her handwriting. Northcote moved toward the hallway. Shall we bring her back? No, Miss Marple said, rising at last, folding her knitting away. Let's go to her, before she finds reason to forget any more of the truth. Ask ChatGPT the walk to Dora. Blackwell's cottage was short, but heavy with questions. The day had turned damp, the sky hung with low grey clouds that pressed down like judgment. Miss Marple moved at a steady pace, her parasol tapping rhythmically along the lane, Craddock and Northcote trailing just behind. When they reached the little ivy-covered house opposite the vicarage, Miss Marple didn't knock. She simply opened the gate and walked up the garden path with quiet purpose, like someone returning to a room they'd once left in anger. Dora answered the door at once, as though she'd been waiting for them. Her face was pale, her hands tucked nervously into the folds of her skirt. You've remembered something, she said, not asking, but stating. Yes, Miss Marple replied. But more importantly, I think you have. Dora hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, her sitting room was plain and overly neat. Tea things laid out untouched, the hearth cold. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph, framed, small, and turned slightly toward the wall. Miss Marple stepped toward it, gently adjusted it to face forward. It was a photo of Alice Carruthers, smiling, younger, taken before the war. I suppose I never really let her go, Dora murmured. Miss Marple turned. You didn't just know Alice, you loved her. The silence that followed was thick and long. Dora sat down slowly, her hands trembling. She was lightning in a bottle. We met in 43 during a transport posting near Portsmouth. She was reckless and beautiful and free. I wasn't. Miss Marple gave a soft nod, her tone kind. But love is rarely logical, is it? Not then, and not now. She never knew, Dora whispered. Or maybe she did. I followed her to St. Mary Mead, pretending it was by chance. Rented a room
nearby, visited as often as I could. I thought if I stayed close enough, maybe she'd see.
But she didn't, Miss Marple said. No, she was caught up with Harold and Lydia. There was tension there, always. Lydia was cold, but possessive. Harold, well, he was jealous. Not of other men, but of her freedom. He wanted to control
her. Craddock leaned forward. So there was motive. For both of them. Oh, everyone had a motive, Dora said bitterly. That's what you're all trying to work out, isn't it? Who wanted her dead? You could line up a dozen names.
Lydia resented her. Harold feared her. The village gossiped about her. She brought out the worst in people because she made them want things they couldn't have. "And you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dora's eyes shone. "I wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with me." Craddock took out his notebook. "You said you visited the house in 47. When exactly?" Dora's shoulders slumped. "That's what I haven't told you. It wasn't just a visit. I was there the night she died." Miss Marple sat down beside her, expression unreadable. Dora's voice was slow now, trembling. "It was August. Hot. I came uninvited. I'd heard something from the grocer, that Harold had packed a bag, said he was leaving. I panicked. I walked to the house and let myself in. I'd done it before, used the spare key under the pot." "What did you see?" Craddock asked. "Lydia was in the drawing room, drunk, furious. I heard shouting upstairs." Alice's voice. She sounded afraid. I rushed up, thinking Harold was hurting her, but he wasn't there. It was just Alice, standing by the window holding Lydia's suitcase. She said she was leaving, that she couldn't take the tension anymore. Miss Marple leaned in. "And Lydia?" She followed me up. She was shaking. She told Alice she couldn't leave, that Harold had gone because of her, and that if Alice left too, she'd have nothing. Alice said maybe that's what she deserved. Lydia lost control. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace on the landing and swung. I think she meant to scare her, but she hit her head. Alice fell, crumpled at the foot of the stairs. "Dead." "And Harold?" Craddock asked, stunned. "He wasn't there," Dora whispered. "But I knew what would happen. They'd blame Lydia. The village hated her already. She wasn't strong enough for prison. She swallowed hard. "I convinced her to leave, told her to run. I buried the body myself. Beneath the rose garden, no one saw me." Craddock stared at her. "You buried a body? Alone?" Dora nodded. "It took me hours. I wrapped Alice in Lydia's coat, then staged the exit. Walked to the station, made sure people saw me. Everyone believed it was Alice leaving town. It worked." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was racing. "You did it out of love," she said, "but you protected the wrong person." Dora blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple stood slowly. "You believed Lydia killed Alice in a fit of rage. But I don't think that's the truth. You only arrived after the shouting. You heard a fight, but you didn't see the blow. But Lydia confessed," Dora said faintly. "In a panic," Miss Marple replied. "Or perhaps because it was easier than telling the truth. But there's a detail that never fit." She gestured to Craddock. "Bring out the letters," he returned, with the evidence bag, placing it gently on Dora's tea table. Miss Marple tapped the one on top. These were not written by Lydia. They were written by Alice. Dora stared. "That can't be. I buried Alice. I saw her face." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice quieter now. "You buried Lydia. That's why Alice, now calling herself Eleanor, never had visitors, never had photographs, never once allowed her face into the local paper. She lived as Lydia because no one would come looking for her. You helped her cover up a murder, believing she was the victim." Craddock's face had gone pale. "So she killed Lydia, then let Dora believe the opposite?" "Fear makes clever." "Liars," Miss Marple said. Alice realized that letting someone else carry the guilt was safer, and Dora's devotion blinded her. Tears welled in Dora's eyes. No, she wouldn't have done that." But even as she said it, the truth settled in her bones like frost. Northcote, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "So Alice Carruthers murdered her brother's wife, lived in her place for nearly 40 years, and only confessed when she knew death would take her soon. Miss Marple nodded softly. A final act of conscience or cowardice. But even then she couldn't bring herself to name the woman she killed. She simply called her the woman I killed, as if that made it easier. Craddock folded his notebook shut. "We'll need to take a full statement, Mrs. Blackwell." But Dora didn't move. Her hands clutched the photograph of Alice Carruthers, her mouth pressed in a tight, heartbroken line. "I loved a ghost," she said, almost inaudibly. "And she let me." Outside, the village bell rang the hour, 12 sharp, a clean, clear tone, but inside the little cottage only silence remained, thick and accusing. The web was untangled, but it had been spun with care, and love, twisted by fear, had held it together far longer than truth ever could. The mood at the station was one of quiet triumph. Inspector Craddock stood by the blackboard, newly scribbled with timelines and names, the centre circled in red, Alice Carruthers, C. Eleanor Wren, T. Murderer. Beneath it, Lydia Carruthers, deemed victim, confirmed by dental ID. On another board, Dora Blackwell's name had been boxed in faint chalk, marked accessory after the fact. Confession pending. Craddock rubbed the chalk from his hands and turned to Northcote. "We've got motive, confession, identity fraud, and a confirmed body. The path is clean, direct, it's over." Northcote didn't disagree. "The press will have a field day."
40-year-old murder cracked by handwritten letters and garden bones. Can't get more British than that. Yet Miss Marple said nothing. She sat on the wooden bench near the window, her gloved hands resting in her lap, her eyes drawn to the shifting shadows outside.
Something was wrong. Not a loud, obvious wrong, but a quiet one, like a loose thread on a perfect tapestry that, when pulled, might unravel everything. Craddock noticed her silence. "You disagree?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "It is a compelling narrative, neat, final, but the truth rarely offers such tidy endings." Craddock blinked. "You think we're missing something?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she rose and walked to the evidence table. The letters were laid out neatly beside the forged identification papers found in Eleanor's desk. She picked up the top letter once more, her fingers lingering on the paper's edge. "She wrote these," Miss Marple said softly. "But they weren't confessions. They were apologies, fragments, hints, but not the truth." Craddock frowned. "We confirmed the handwriting, the bones, the identity." "Yes," she said. "We confirmed that the woman who lived as Eleanor Wren murdered someone and buried her beneath the rose garden." "But what if the woman who wrote these letters wasn't the only one who knew?" Craddock exchanged a look with Northcote, who stepped forward. "You think someone else was involved?" "I think someone else has been shaping this story," she said. "From the very beginning." Northcote arched an eyebrow. "You're suggesting a second party, someone orchestrating from behind?" Miss Marple gestured to the board. "The story fits too well. Alice disappears, Lydia is buried, Eleanor Wren emerges, and Dora Blackwell so conveniently fills in."
The emotional gaps, but where's Harold Carruthers in all this? Why has he remained silent? Craddock scratched his chin.
"We assumed he left after his wife's disappearance? Started over?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But this entire charade depended on him staying away, on him never speaking. And yet there's no proof that he didn't know. In fact, the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that Harold wasn't absent at all." Northcote blinked. "Wait, are you saying Harold helped cover it up?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly.
I'm saying he designed the cover-up. Craddock's voice sharpened. That's a serious accusation. It is. But consider this. He and Lydia lived in that house. The body was buried in their garden. Do you know who first planted those rose bushes? Craddock shook his head. Harold, she said. I remember him boasting about it at church.
A place to nurture beauty, he called it. He dug those beds himself, the very beds beneath which Lydia's body would be hidden months later. Northcote looked thoughtful now. That is convenient. Miss Marple nodded, and then he left, quietly, publicly grieving a wife who had supposedly left him. But never once did he return. Not when Eleanor, his sister, posing as his dead wife, was dying. Not when the vicarage changed hands. Not even when the village began whispering. Because he knew, Craddock said slowly. Because he'd
made a deal. Miss Marple turned to the window. Alice was clever, yes, but not cold-blooded, not alone, not without guidance.
Someone helped her become Lydia, someone ensured no loose ends, and then that someone vanished, until now. Northcote straightened. You think Harold is still involved? I think he's been waiting, Miss Marple said, and watching as, if summoned by her words, a knock echoed through the hallway. Constable Graves poked his head in. There's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Carruthers, Harold Carruthers. Craddock stood up. Send him in. The man who entered was old, older than the photo Miss Marple remembered, but still sharp-eyed. Neatly dressed, hands firm, expression unreadable, he looked at the three of them, nodded politely. I understand you found my wife, he said, and my sister. Craddock gestured for him to sit. Yes, Mr. Carruthers, we've identified Lydia's remains and confirmed that your sister lived under her identity for decades. I expected this day, Harold said. It was only a matter of time. Miss Marple stepped forward. You knew? He turned to her. His face showed no shame, only calculation. Of course I knew. Alice came to me the night it happened. She was covered in blood. Said Lydia had attacked her and that it was self-defense. I didn't ask for details, I just handled it. Handled it how? Craddock asked sharply. I helped her bury the body, helped her disappear, told her to become Lydia. She was already halfway there, same size, same colouring. All it took was some silence and a little gardening. Miss Marple studied his face. But then you left. Of course. Couldn't have two of us living under the same roof with a dead woman beneath the roses, could we? Craddock stared. You helped her? Then walked away. Harold shrugged. I did what I had to do. Family first. Miss Marple stepped closer. But you came back now. Why? Because I read the obituary, he said simply. Eleanor Wren, dead at 89, and I knew what would follow. The truth was about to be exhumed. Quite literally, I thought I'd get ahead of it, present myself, help close the book, so to speak. Craddock gave a dry laugh. You think this clears you? I buried a body 40 years ago. Good luck proving it. He smiled faintly. The world's moved on, so have I. Miss Marple didn't smile. She turned to Craddock and Northcote. He's right. You won't find prints, nor witnesses, nor tools. The evidence is too old, but make no mistake, this man orchestrated a murder cover-up, and perhaps more. Craddock opened his mouth, but Northcote spoke first. Mr. Carruthers, he said quietly, you're not under arrest yet, but I would suggest you remain available for questioning. Harold only nodded. Of course. He left moments later, stepping into the misty dusk as if he'd merely dropped in to settle an old debt. But Miss Marple watched the shadows cling to him. This isn't over, she said softly. Craddock frowned.
We've got everything. What's left? Miss Marple turned from the window. We have a corpse. We have a confession. And we have a man who just returned from the dead to tie a neat bow around it all. She folded her gloves and looked each of them in the eye. But we don't yet have the truth. The village had gone quiet again. Rain tapped gently against the windows of the vicarage, where Inspector Craddock and Northcote sat surrounded by case files, maps, and crumbling letters.
The Carruthers case, as the papers were now calling it, had ignited a national sensation. But within this storm of attention, Miss Marple remained still, staring into the hearth where no fire had burned since spring. A confession. A corpse, an accomplice, and a gentleman who walks in 40 years later to settle the dust, Craddock muttered, flipping through his notes. Should be the end. And yet it doesn't feel like one, Northcote said quietly. Miss Marple spoke at
Last.
Because it isn't. Craddock raised his head. Still convinced there's more? Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she held up a faded newspaper clipping, pulled from an old police file no one had touched in decades. The headline read, "Schoolteacher found dead in trunk. Mystery in Market Darnley." The photo below it showed a young woman, hair in neat waves, eyes wide with fear, caught forever in the camera's flash. Northcote blinked. That's from the 30s. 1937, Miss Marple confirmed. Her name was Elsie Beckett, a schoolteacher in Market Darnley. Went missing one autumn night, found 3 weeks later, dead, in a steamer trunk left at a train station. Craddock leaned forward. Why are we looking at this? Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost reverent. Because this case was never solved. No suspects, no known enemies, no motive. But a curious detail always bothered me. She held up another clipping, this one detailing the discovery of Lydia Carruthers' remains. Both women had broken fingers, defensive wounds, both buried or hidden, with traces of lavender soap and floral cloth.
And most interestingly, both women once taught at St. Hilda's Academy for Girls. Northcote's brow furrowed. Wait, Lydia was a student, wasn't she? She was, Miss Marple nodded. But she returned there as a substitute teacher?
In the spring of 1937, the same year, Elsie Beckett vanished. Craddock's voice was low. You think the murders are connected? I think Lydia Carruthers, before she was Lydia, was involved in something long before she ever met Harold, Alice, or Dora. Something that followed her. Or perhaps something she brought with her. The three sat in silence. Then Northcote leaned back. That's a long time ago. We'd need more than broken fingers and soap to prove a connection. Miss Marple didn't seem discouraged. We need to look beyond the crime scene. Crimes are rarely about the moment they happen. They're about the history people carry. Craddock stood and walked to the map. He pinned a red dot on Market Darnley and another on St. Mary Mead. 40 miles apart, not exactly a world away. And Dora Blackwell, Miss Marple added, was also at St. Hilda's, as a pupil. Her scholarship began in 1937. She would have known both women. Craddock turned. So you're saying Dora's connection to Alice, Eleanor Wren, or Lydia wasn't a chance meeting?
Exactly, Miss Marple said. Dora always said she found Eleanor decades later, broken and hiding. But what if she sought her out? What if their bond began not with compassion, but with shared guilt? Northcote's eyes widened.
You think the murder in 1937, Elsie Beckett, was the start of all this? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that something terrible happened at that school. And Lydia, Eleanor, was at the centre of it. I think she killed once before, and someone helped her hide it. Craddock began sorting through the dusty old school rosters and local reports. Elsie Beckett was strict, known for discipline. Might have had enemies, Miss Marple nodded. And Lydia, then known as Eleanor, had been asked to leave another school under suspicious circumstances. Her record was sealed, but I remember whispers. Northcote added, if Dora was there, she might have seen something. Been coerced into silence. That would explain her lifelong loyalty. And her reluctance to speak even now, Miss Marple said. She wasn't covering up one murder, she was covering two. Craddock tapped the table. So what does Harold Carruthers have to do with this? That, Miss Marple said softly, is the piece I haven't placed. That evening they returned to speak with Dora. She sat in her little cottage, hands trembling around a cup of tea. The storm outside matched her expression, tense, waiting to break. Miss Marple sat opposite her. Dora, we've uncovered something.
An old tragedy. A teacher, Elsie Beckett. Do you remember her? Dora froze. The teacup clicked against the saucer. I remember. You were there when she disappeared.
A nod, small, reluctant. You knew Lydia then too, before she became Eleanor. Another nod. Dora, what happened in 1937? Her voice was barely a whisper. She caught them, that's what Lydia said. Elsie caught her with one of the other girls.
A scandal! Lydia begged her not to report it, but Miss Beckett said she would. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And Lydia killed her? I don't know. I never saw it. But the next day, Lydia had scratches down her arm. And Miss Beckett
was gone, Craddock asked. And you never told anyone? We were children, Dora said, eyes wide and wet. I was 13. She said I'd be expelled, that they'd take me away from my parents. She said it was our secret. And then she left the school. I never saw her again until I found her years later, living as someone else. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did Harold Carruthers know? No, Dora whispered. Not about the
school. Not about Elsie. Just Lydia. Just what she told him about that night in the garden. Northcote asked gently, did she ever tell you what happened to Lydia Carruthers? Dora hesitated. She said she didn't mean to. That Lydia found
out something about her past, about Market Darnley. Threatened to expose her. They argued. There was a struggle, and Lydia fell. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her voice was firm. She killed to protect herself, again. Dora didn't deny it, and suddenly the past wasn't just a shadow. It was the shape of everything, a secret buried not once but twice. First, beneath a train station, then beneath a rose garden, covered by silence, by loyalty, by guilt. As they left the cottage, Craddock said softly, We've been chasing this case in circles, but it started long before any of us arrived. Miss Marple looked up at the storm clouds overhead. Yes, she said, and the rain always brings the past to the surface. Morning broke with a thin veil of mist blanketing St. Mary Mead. It curled along the hedgerows and pooled in the garden corners, softening the hard edges of truth that Inspector Craddock had been hunting for weeks. But inside the vicarage there was no softness, only silence, maps and tension. Miss Marple was knitting again, slowly, thoughtfully. Each click of the needles echoed the ticking of the grandfather clock. Craddock paced. We have enough circumstantial evidence to charge Eleanor Wren, Lydia, with the death of Lydia Carruthers, and we might link her to the disappearance of Elsie Beckett, but it's too old, too cold. Northcote said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the corkboard covered in strings and faces. Dora, Harold, Eleanor, even the shadowy Beckett case pinned like a ghost in the corner. Miss Marple didn't look up. Charging Eleanor won't bring you the truth, Inspector. She's confessed in a roundabout way, Craddock replied. Dora practically admitted it too. And yet... Miss Marple paused. There's still something missing, Craddock sighed. What would you have us do then? She stopped knitting. Something unconventional. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Miss Marple stood. I need Eleanor brought to the vicarage, alone. An hour later, Eleanor Wren stepped
into the study.
Her face was pale, her gloves immaculate, and her eyes the same cold grey as the morning mist, Miss Marple, she said quietly. You asked for me. Yes, my dear, the elderly woman replied with a gentle smile. Please, sit, Eleanor. Did. I've been thinking about tea, Miss Marple began. Craddock, in the corner of the room, blinked. Tea? Yes, she said. It's fascinating, don't you think? The rituals, the choices people make. Milk in first or second, lemon or sugar, or no tea at all. Eleanor tilted her head, confused. I suppose? You strike me as someone who prefers Earl Grey, light, precise. Eleanor's lips curled faintly. Correct. And yet, Miss Marple went on, when you visited Dora last week, she offered Darjeeling, and you drank it without complaint. Odd, isn't it? Craddock frowned. Is this really... Patience, Miss Marple murmured. Eleanor's expression didn't change. It would have been rude to object. Of course, Miss Marple smiled. But let me tell you something curious. When I visited Dora yesterday, she gave me the same cup. And do you know what I found? Eleanor didn't answer. Miss Marple's voice softened. Lavender. In the tea. Eleanor blinked. Just once. She used lavender sachets to line the drawer, where she stores the loose leaves, a comforting scent, familiar, but not everyone reacts well to it. Now Craddock stepped forward. Lydia Carruthers hated lavender, allergic to it apparently. Her sister mentioned it years ago. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, and yet Dora served it to Eleanor in the same blend, as if it were deliberate. Pause. Then Eleanor's voice, quiet and even. What are you trying to say? Miss Marple leaned in. I think Dora suspected you were lying. I think she set a trap.
Not with poison or violence, but memory, emotion. Eleanor stared at her, then laughed, a short, brittle sound. Aromatic tea as a moral test? How very... Marple, Miss Marple returned the smile. Oh, the tea's only the beginning. Tell me, do you remember Latin? Eleanor froze. Miss Marple picked up a schoolbook, faded, annotated. Found this in Dora's attic.
Belonged to Lydia Carruthers, full of notes scribbled in the margins. One phrase caught my attention. She opened the book. Fiat veritas et pereat mundus. Let truth be done, though the world perish. She closed it softly. Do
you believe that, Eleanor? Eleanor's fingers twitched against her gloves. Because I think Lydia did. I think she found out what you did in Market Darnley to Miss Beckett, and she meant to expose you, not because she hated you, but because
she believed the truth mattered. Then Northcote leaned back. That's a long time ago. We'd need more than broken fingers and soap to prove a connection. Miss Marple didn't seem discouraged. We need to look beyond the crime scene. Crimes are rarely about the moment they happen. They're about the history people carry. Craddock stood and walked to the map. He pinned a red dot on Market Darnley and another on St. Mary Mead. 40 miles apart, not exactly a world away. And Dora Blackwell, Miss Marple added, was also at St. Hilda's as a pupil, Her scholarship began in 1937. She would have known both women. Craddock turned. So you're saying Dora's connection to Alice, Eleanor Wren or Lydia, wasn't a chance meeting?
Exactly, Miss Marple said. Dora always said she found Eleanor decades later, broken and hiding. But what if she sought her out? What if their bond began not with compassion, but with shared guilt? Northcote's eyes widened.
You think the murder in 1937, Elsie Beckett, was the start of all this? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that something terrible happened at that school.
And Lydia, Eleanor, was at the centre of it. I think she killed once before, and someone helped her hide it. Craddock began sorting through the dusty old school rosters and local reports. Elsie Beckett was strict, known for discipline. Might have had enemies, Miss Marple nodded. And Lydia, then known as Eleanor, had been asked to leave another school under suspicious circumstances. Her record was sealed, but I remember whispers. Northcote added, if Dora was there,
She might have seen something, been coerced into silence. That would explain her lifelong loyalty. And her reluctance to speak even now, Miss Marple said. She wasn't covering up one murder, she was covering two. Craddock tapped the table. So what does Harold Carruthers have to do with this? That, Miss Marple said softly, is the piece I haven't placed. That evening they returned to speak with Dora. She sat in her little cottage, hands trembling around a cup of tea. The storm outside matched her expression, tense, waiting to break. Miss Marple sat opposite her. Dora, we've uncovered something.
an old tragedy, a teacher, Elsie Beckett. Do you remember her? Dora froze. The teacup clicked against the saucer. I remember. You were there when she disappeared.
A nod. Small, reluctant. You knew Lydia then too, before she became Eleanor. Another nod. Dora, what happened in 1937? Her voice was barely a whisper. She caught them, that's what Lydia said. Elsie caught her with one of the other girls.
A scandal. Lydia begged her not to report it, but Miss Beckett said she would. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And Lydia killed her? I don't know, I never saw it. But the next day, Lydia had scratches down her arm. And Miss Beckett was gone. Craddock asked. And you never told anyone? We were children, Dora said, eyes wide and wet. I was 13. She said I'd be expelled, that they'd take me away from my parents.
She said it was our secret. And then she left the school. I never saw her again until I found her years later, living as someone else. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did Harold Carruthers know? No, Dora whispered. Not about the
school. Not about Elsie, just Lydia. Just what she told him about that night in the garden. Northcote asked gently, did she ever tell you what happened to Lydia Carruthers? Dora hesitated. She said she didn't mean to, that Lydia found out something about her past, about Market Darnley.
Threatened to expose her. They argued. There was a struggle, and Lydia fell. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her voice was firm. She killed to protect herself. Again, Dora didn't deny it, and suddenly the past wasn't. Just a shadow. It was the shape of everything, a secret buried not once but twice. First, beneath a train station, then beneath a rose garden, covered by silence, by loyalty, by guilt. As they left the cottage, Craddock said softly, We've been chasing this case in circles, but it started long before any of us arrived. Miss Marple looked up at the storm clouds overhead. Yes, she said, and the rain always brings the past to the surface. Morning broke with a thin veil of mist blanketing St. Mary Mead. It curled along the hedgerows and pooled in the garden corners, softening the hard edges of truth that Inspector Craddock had been hunting for weeks. But inside the vicarage there was no softness, only silence, maps, and tension. Miss Marple was knitting again. Slowly, thoughtfully. Each click of the needles echoed the ticking of the grandfather clock. Craddock paced. We have enough circumstantial evidence to charge Eleanor Wren, Lydia, with the death of Lydia Carruthers. And we might link her to the disappearance of Elsie Beckett, but it's too old, too cold. Northcote said nothing, but his eyes were fixed on the corkboard covered in strings and faces, Dora, Harold, Eleanor, even the shadowy Beckett case pinned like a ghost in the corner. Miss Marple didn't look up. Charging Eleanor won't bring you the truth, Inspector. She's confessed in a roundabout way, Craddock replied. Dora practically admitted it too. And yet... Miss Marple paused. There's still something missing, Craddock sighed. What would you have us do then? She stopped knitting. Something unconventional. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Miss Marple stood. I need Eleanor brought to the vicarage, alone. An hour later, Eleanor Wren stepped into the study. Her face was pale, her gloves immaculate, and her eyes the same cold grey as the morning mist. Miss Marple, she said quietly, you asked for me? Yes, my dear, the elderly woman replied with a gentle smile. Please, sit, Eleanor. Did. I've been thinking about tea, Miss Marple began. Craddock, in the corner of the room, blinked. Tea? Yes, she said. It's fascinating, don't you think? The rituals, the choices people make. Milk in first or second, lemon or sugar, or no tea at all. Eleanor tilted her head, confused. I suppose? You strike me as someone who prefers Earl Grey. Light, precise. Eleanor's lips curled faintly. Correct.
And yet, Miss Marple went on, when you visited Dora last week, she offered Darjeeling, and you drank it without complaint. Odd, isn't it? Craddock frowned. Is this really? Patience, Miss Marple murmured. Eleanor's expression
didn't change. It would have been rude to object. Of course, Miss Marple smiled, but let me tell you something curious. When I visited Dora yesterday, she gave me the same cup. And do you know what I found? Eleanor didn't answer. Miss Marple's voice softened. Lavender, in the tea. Eleanor blinked. Just once. She used lavender sachets to line the drawer, where she stores the loose leaves, a comforting scent, familiar, but not everyone reacts well to it. Now Craddock stepped forward. Lydia Carruthers hated lavender, allergic to it apparently. Her sister mentioned it years ago. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, and yet Dora served it to Eleanor in the same blend, as if it were deliberate. A pause. Then Eleanor's voice, quiet and even. What are you trying to say? Miss Marple leaned in. I think Dora suspected you were lying. I think she set a trap, not with poison or violence, but memory, emotion. Eleanor stared at her, then laughed, a short, brittle sound. Aromatic tea is a moral test? How very... Marple. Miss Marple returned the smile. Oh, the tea is only the beginning. Tell...
Me, do you remember Latin? Eleanor froze. Miss Marple picked up a schoolbook. Faded. Annotated. Found this in Dora's attic.
Belonged to Lydia Carruthers, full of notes, scribbled in the margins. One phrase caught my attention. She opened the book. Fiat veritas et pereat mundus. Let truth be done, though the world perish. She closed it softly. Do you believe that, Eleanor? Eleanor's fingers twitched against her gloves, because I think Lydia did. I think she found out what you did in Market Darnley. to Miss Beckett, and she meant to expose you, not because she hated you, but because she believed the truth mattered.
She threatened me, Eleanor snapped. Craddock stepped forward. Then what happened? You pushed her? You struck her? Eleanor looked down at her lap. I don't know, it was fast. We argued. She was furious. She knew everything about Elsie, about the school, about what I'd become.
She called me a monster. She closed her eyes. And maybe I was. I shoved her. She fell. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. You buried her beneath the garden, wrapped in a sheet that smelled of lavender. Eleanor nodded, slowly. It seemed fitting. She loved that garden. Craddock exhaled. You realize this is a confession. Eleanor nodded again, but her face was serene. She would have told the world, exposed me. I would have lost everything. You should have, Miss Marple said, her voice suddenly sharper. You already had lost everything, long before Lydia confronted you. You lost it when you let Elsie Beckett die. Eleanor looked up, eyes flashing. She threatened me too. She wanted to ruin my future over a harmless indiscretion. I panicked. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. But it did, Miss Marple said coldly. And you spent the rest of your life hiding until it caught up to you. Again, Eleanor stood slowly. I suppose that's it then? Craddock nodded. You'll come with us, Miss Wren. She looked out the window. The mist had begun to clear, revealing the green lanes of St. Mary Mead stretching beyond. It's strange, she said softly. All this time I thought I was burying the past. But it never went away. It just waited. Later that evening, as the village returned to its quiet rhythms, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire. Northcote returned from the station. She's in custody, full written confession. The Darnley authorities will reopen the Beckett case too. Craddock poured tea. You really got her with lavender and Latin, Miss Marple? She smiled. Not quite. I got her with her own conscience. All she needed was a push. The rest was theatrical dressing, Northcote chuckled. You played her like a violin. People rarely break from force, Miss Marple said. But pressure in the right place, gentle, familiar, reveals far more. Craddock raised his cup. 2 unconventional clues. She raised her own. And to the truth, however long it takes to find. The storm arrived without warning. Rain lashed the windows of the St. Mary Mead police station, thunder rumbling low like a growl from the earth. Inside, the mood was just as dark. Inspector Craddock stood by the evidence locker, staring at the empty shelf that had, until this morning, held the single most damning item in the Lydia Carruthers case. The ledger was gone. Northcote arrived moments later, his coat dripping. You sent for me? Craddock turned slowly. The garden ledger, Dora's copy, the one Lydia annotated, with the dates, the coded entries, the receipts, all of it, vanished. Northcote froze. Gone? Are you sure it wasn't moved for processing? No.
Record of it, Craddock growled, and no one signed it out, which means someone bypassed every protocol to make it disappear.
Behind them, Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her. It's begun then. Craddock turned. What has? The clean-up, she said softly. Whoever aided Eleanor, whoever stood to lose if the truth came out, they're still watching, still working, Northcote frowned. But Eleanor confessed. To Lydia's death, Miss Marple said. Not to everything else, not to the deeper rot. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. So now we have no ledger, no trace of its
last handler, and a locked building that shows no signs of forced entry. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Unless the enemy was already inside?
It had taken weeks for Dora Carruthers to come forward after her sister's death. Her mind was clouded, grief mingled with guilt. But the moment she produced the garden ledger, a handwritten journal Lydia kept in obsessive detail, everything changed. It had outlined a strange pattern of guests, deliveries and coded references over the last year of Lydia's life. The entries made little sense on their own. But with Eleanor's confession, the pieces had started to align. Financial blackmail, the threat of exposure, a woman trapped by past crimes, and now the book was gone. Craddock ordered the building locked down. Every officer and clerk was questioned. The security footage, such as it was, offered only shadows, angles just off, frames blurred during the night storm. "That's not an accident," Northcote muttered. Someone knew where the blind spots were. Miss Marple remained at the edges of the investigation, knitting as she listened. When asked what she thought, she only said, "Look for the one who benefits from silence. Not just the murderer, but those complicit." Craddock grumbled but followed her advice. By evening, suspicion had begun to bloom like mould. Officer Chapman, a night duty constable, claimed to have seen the ledger on its shelf just after midnight. By dawn it was gone. No one remembered seeing him after 2 a.m., but Chapman, when pressed, showed a record of phone calls made to his sick mother during that time, confirmed by hospital staff. "Someone's playing us," Craddock muttered. "Creating ghosts." Miss Marple visited Dora that evening. The woman was pale, hunched over her kitchen table, sipping herbal tea. "They said it's missing." "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple replied gently. Dora's hands trembled. "That
Ledger. It was Lydia's mind on paper, her secrets, her fears, and her revenge.
She never told me what some of it meant, but she wanted someone to know. She left it hidden behind the rosewood dresser. And someone else knew where to find it, Miss Marple said. Dora nodded. There was one man, a lawyer. Lydia dealt with him privately. She said he handled certain inheritances, confidential matters. He was charming, cold. Name? Dora hesitated. Julian Hale, from Market Darnley. The next morning, Craddock and Northcote drove to Market Darnley to confront Mr. Hale. But the man had vanished. His office neatly emptied. Files shredded, phones disconnected. Too clean, Craddock muttered. This isn't just about Eleanor anymore, but something remained. A clerk, left behind to liquidate the office, mentioned a package Hale had mailed just before closing shop. Said it was insurance if things went bad. The destination? St. Mary Mead, to Miss Marple. By the time they returned, the storm had passed, and a small brown package sat on Miss Marple's table, wrapped in twine. She opened it carefully. Inside, a thin sheaf of photocopied pages, sections of the original ledger, not the whole book, but enough. Enough to prove that Hale had been funneling money from Lydia's estate into offshore accounts. Enough to show he'd helped cover up something involving the Beckett girl. Enough to suggest that Eleanor wasn't acting alone, and then a final envelope sealed in red wax. Inside, a single sheet handwritten in trembling script. If anything happens to me, Julian Hale is not the end. He is a servant. There are others. Lydia saw too much. Eleanor was only the beginning. Look to the past. Look to the academy. Elsie. B. Craddock read the note 3 times. The academy? The old girls' school? It shut down 20 years ago. Miss Marple tapped her chin. Perhaps it should not have. That night, Craddock met with Miss Marple beneath the gaslight of the churchyard path. The sky was clear again, stars poking through velvet black. She was right, he said quietly. Eleanor wasn't working alone. Hale covered for her. And now he's gone. And the girl, Miss Marple whispered, warned us. Even from
beyond the grave, Craddock rubbed his face. We're missing something big, Miss Marple nodded. The evidence may be vanishing, but the truth, Inspector.
the truth has a way of lingering. Like the scent of lavender in a closed room. You can't always see it, but it never really goes away. The next morning, a break came from an unexpected source. A young constable named Ellis, quiet and bookish, approached Northcote. "There's a rumour," he said, "among the archivists that Lydia Carruthers donated part of her personal library to the Academy just before it closed. So, she marked them with her own seal. If we find those books, we might find more than literature." Craddock and Northcote exchanged glances. Miss Marple smiled, and in the distance, thunder rolled once more. It began with silence. Inspector Craddock had grown used to the low hum of tension that surrounded the Carruthers investigation, the ticking clock of mounting pressure, the muted footsteps of suspicion echoing down the stone corridors of the station. But this morning, it was different, too quiet. The usual chatter from the front desk had vanished. A young constable, pale and shaking, met him at the stairwell with a single word. "Northcote." Craddock didn't wait for the rest. He pushed past, thunder in his boots, and climbed 2 steps at a time to the 3rd floor. There, in the evidence review room, lay Detective Northcote unconscious. Slumped in his chair, a thin line of blood trailing from his temple. The window behind him was shattered, the cold morning breeze whispering through the jagged glass. Scattered across the floor were remnants of paperwork, torn files, and smudged photographs, the copied pages of Lydia Carruthers' ledger, the few that had survived. "He's alive," the medic reported. "Concussion, bruised ribs, but nothing."
Fatal. Craddock barely acknowledged the words. His gaze remained fixed on the broken window.
A chair had been shoved against it from the inside, suggesting a struggle. No one had seen anyone enter or leave. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints left behind. Another ghost, another shadow. Miss Marple arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by Constable Ellis. She surveyed the room with narrowed eyes. The attacker didn't come to kill, they came to retrieve. Craddock nodded grimly. The remaining copies. Northcote was cross-referencing the entries with Academy records, matching names. "And someone didn't like the matches," Miss Marple said quietly. A sudden new detail stood out to Craddock. The red wax envelope. It was missing. That night Northcote regained consciousness. His voice was hoarse but clear. "I didn't see their face," he whispered. "They wore gloves, black coat, moved like they knew the place. Fast, efficient." Craddock leaned closer. "Did they say anything?" Northcote's brow furrowed. "One thing, just one word." "What?" "She's watching." The following morning, the village woke to another shock. Dora Carruthers had vanished. Her home, locked from the inside, showed signs of a hasty departure. Teacups spilled, a handbag missing, the back door unlatched. There was no note, no struggle, just an eerie calm. Miss Marple stood in the sitting room, examining the overturned armchair. "She didn't run," she said flatly. "She was taken." Craddock crossed his arms. "The question is, why now?" "Because she remembered something," Miss Marple replied. "Or someone remembered her." Later that day, a single envelope arrived at the police station. No stamp, no return address. Just Craddock's name, handwritten in a delicate feminine script. Inside, a photograph. Faded, aged, and unmistakably damning. It was a class photo, St. Mary Mead Girls' Academy, 1949. Standing in the centre was a younger Lydia Carruthers, smiling, confident, flanked by other girls, among them Dora Carruthers, and in the back row Craddock blinked.
"Is that Eleanor Beckett?" Miss Marple took the photo gently, eyes scanning. "And there," she said, tapping the corner, "Julian Hale, not a student, a tutor." Craddock stiffened. He worked there? For 3 years, before being
dismissed quietly. No formal charges. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes were storm dark. "There's something older than this murder," she murmured. "Something that's been buried for decades." Constable Ellis returned with news from the archives. A long-forgotten incident had been buried in the Academy's final years. A girl, Emily Hargrove, had gone missing, vanished one winter night. The case was ruled a runaway, but whispers of inappropriate conduct by a staff member had briefly surfaced. The staff member, Julian Hale. And the year, 1949. Craddock stared at the board of notes and photographs, his mind racing. Eleanor Beckett had been part of that school, Lydia and Dora too. Hale was more than just a legal fixer. He was part of a past they'd all tried to forget, a past worth killing to keep hidden. And now Dora, the last person who might have spoken about what happened, was gone. Miss Marple sat quietly across the room, knitting. "Inspector," she said softly, "you must understand, this isn't a murder case."
"Any more?" Craddock turned. "Then what is it?" "A reckoning."
That evening, a call came in from the groundskeeper of the now-abandoned academy. He'd found something unusual. Craddock and Ellis arrived just before dusk. The building loomed like a decaying monument, its ivy-covered walls cracked and sagging. The groundskeeper led them to the old greenhouse behind the dormitories. There, half buried beneath weeds, was Dora Carruthers' handbag. Inside, her keys, a blood-streaked scarf, and a crumpled note scrawled in charcoal with 3 words. She remembered everything. Craddock's gut clenched. "She's here," he muttered. Or was. They began a sweep of the building. The academy, though abandoned, still reeked of history. Dust-covered furniture, shattered windows, forgotten lessons scrawled on chalkboards. The main hall had collapsed long ago, but the basement rooms remained.
Intact. Old storerooms, servant quarters, a sealed cellar. Ellis called out from behind a broken bookshelf, "Inspector, you'll want to see this." Behind the shelf was a narrow stairwell, previously hidden, recently disturbed. Footprints in the dust.
Fresh ones. Craddock drew his revolver and descended slowly. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, a room. Concrete, damp, with rusted chains on the wall and a rotted cot in the corner. Craddock's breath caught. It wasn't just a school.
Had been a prison. On the wall, a message had been etched in chalk. Smudged and hasty, but legible. She was never meant to leave. Emily, Lydia tried to tell. They silenced her. They're silencing me now. Signed. D. Craddock swallowed hard. She's alive, but we're running out of time. By the time they
resurfaced, darkness had fallen. Miss Marple was waiting by the gate, her knitting untouched. She was held there, Craddock said. Like the Hargrove girl, like Lydia might have been once. Miss Marple didn't flinch. And now history repeats itself. They're tying up loose ends. Craddock's voice was low. This is bigger than one killer. This is a network. A pact. Miss Marple nodded, bound by shame, by silence, and by fear. But fear, she said, eyes gleaming, can be turned. How? By forcing their hand, she said. By giving them something to fear more than exposure. Craddock looked at her. And for the first time, the idea of setting a trap didn't seem reckless. It seemed necessary. That night, a broadcast went out through village radio, a small announcement, due to recent breakthroughs in the Lydia Carruthers investigation. Police have obtained evidence linking her death to a cold case from the St. Mary Mead Academy. Authorities will be releasing names of involved parties tomorrow morning. Craddock turned off the recorder. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "We've told them what we want them to believe," she said. "And now?" Craddock asked. "Now," she said softly, "we wait for them to make a mistake." The storm arrived just after midnight. Wind clawed at the village rooftops, rain lashed against the windows of St. Mary Mead, and thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. Inside the Carruthers estate, Inspector Craddock sat in Lydia's study, surrounded by boxes of evidence, photographs, letters, academy files, fragments of a past that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple sat opposite him, unmoving, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The fire crackled between them, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "We're missing something," Craddock muttered for the 100th time. Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the notes pinned to the wall, the timeline, the names. The 3 deaths, Lydia Carruthers, Eleanor Beckett, and now possibly Dora Carruthers, all bound to the academy, all touched by Julian Hale. Craddock stood, pacing. "We've got motive, we've got connections, but we don't have a suspect." Miss Marple didn't respond. Not yet. An hour passed before she spoke. "Tell me again about the ledger," she said suddenly. Craddock blinked. "The one Northcote found? Lydia's personal notebook?" "Yes." He rifled through a stack of folders and pulled out a photograph of the surviving pages, names, donations, meetings, scribbled notes beside each entry, some crossed out, some starred. "She was tracking people connected to the academy," Craddock said. "Mostly donors and former staff." "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple tapped her chin. "Those stars, what do they indicate?" Craddock frowned. "We assumed it meant suspicion. Lydia may have been marking individuals she considered dangerous."
Eleanor Beckett, for instance, starred. Julian Hale starred, but not Dora, Miss Marple murmured. "No, no mark at all," she nodded, "which suggests Lydia trusted her, perhaps even confided in her. That would explain why Dora was—"
Next. Craddock leaned closer. "So what's the link? The real one?" Miss Marple stood and walked to the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes like memories. "There is a pattern, Inspector, but not in the crimes, in the survivors." The next morning brought news that shook them both. Dora Carruthers had been found, alive. Half dazed, she was discovered near the abandoned train depot outside town, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her wrists bruised but otherwise unharmed. She
had no memory of how she got there. No recollection of the past 2 days. But she said one thing over and over again. "I saw her face. I saw her." In the sterile light of the hospital room, Dora lay propped up by pillows. Her voice trembled with exhaustion as Craddock asked gentle questions. "You said you saw someone." "Who?" She closed her eyes. "It wasn't Hale," Craddock
stilled. "Are you sure?" Dora nodded. "It was a woman. Her face. Older now, but I remember her. From school, she was always watching us." "Who?" Dora took a shaky breath. Agnes Weaver, the academy's head housekeeper. Never charged, never questioned. She had retired just before the school's closure and faded quietly into the village, a fixture, unremarkable, unthreatening. Craddock rubbed his temples. We haven't even spoken to her. She's invisible, Miss Marple said softly. The sort of woman everyone overlooks. She never left the village. She attends church, volunteers at the garden club, a quiet, polite spinster. Which makes her the perfect person to hide in plain sight, Craddock muttered. Miss Marple looked grim. And the perfect witness to every secret behind those academy walls. They visited Agnes Weaver that afternoon. Her cottage was immaculate, lace, curtains, well-tended roses, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. She greeted them with a warm smile and a tray of shortbread, her manner calm and practiced. I heard about poor Lydia, she said. Terrible business. Craddock studied her carefully. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. But something about her felt rehearsed. We're revisiting the academy files, Miss Marple said pleasantly. You were housekeeper for over 20 years, weren't you? Agnes chuckled. 22, a lifetime, really? And you must have known the girls well. Like
daughters, some of them. Others, less so. Her eyes flickered briefly. Craddock took a slow breath. Did you know Emily Hargrove?
The smile faded. I remember the name, she said after a moment. She ran away, didn't she? So they claimed, Miss Marple said softly. But you knew better. A beat of silence. Then Agnes's gaze changed. Sharp, brittle. Do you think I hurt that girl? No, Craddock said, leaning forward. We think you saw who did, and you kept silent. Agnes's jaw tightened. She was nothing but trouble. Later, outside the cottage, Craddock exhaled deeply. She's hiding something, Miss Marple nodded, but she won't confess easily. She's had decades to convince herself it wasn't her fault. But what was her role? Craddock asked. Why now? Why help kill Lydia? What triggered?
All this? Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the photo in Craddock's hand, the one from 1949. She pointed to the back row. There, she said.
Next to Hale. Do you see it? Craddock peered closer. A girl with red hair. Look again, she said. It wasn't a student. It was Agnes. She'd been younger, of course, her hair darker then, but unmistakable. She wasn't just
staff, Craddock realized. She was a former pupil, one of them. Back at the station, Craddock reopened Lydia's ledger. He stared at a name that had nagged at him for days. Not because it was suspicious, but because it wasn't a Wren.
A monthly donor, unremarkable, no address listed. He checked it against the village registries. No one named. Wren lived in St. Mary Mead. But there was Agnes Weaver. Craddock blinked. Weaver. Wren. Same initials, similar length. A careless transcription or deliberate misdirection? He checked the handwriting in the ledger, then cross-referenced it with a form Agnes had filled out at the garden club years earlier. Identical loops. The same slant. She was donating, he whispered, to herself. Miss Marple returned with another revelation. In the Academy's final year, the trustees sold off part of the estate to a private buyer. It was done quietly. Only one person ever put in a bid. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Who? Agnes Weaver. And suddenly the pattern emerged. Agnes, once a student, then a housekeeper, had stayed behind after the school closed. She had seen the abuse, had turned a blind eye, or worse, helped cover it up. When the whispers threatened to surface, when Lydia began her investigations, when Dora asked too many questions, Agnes struck. She wasn't just cleaning rooms, she was cleaning history. Craddock issued a warrant. But by the time they arrived at Agnes Weaver's cottage, she was gone. The place was empty, neat, silent. On the kitchen table lay a letter addressed to Miss Marple. She read it aloud. "I only ever wanted peace, but you wouldn't let me have it. I tried to forget what we did. What I let happen, Lydia wanted justice, but she wasn't the only one who suffered. Emily Hargrove wasn't the only one lost. I did what I had to do, I always have. No signature. Just an old academy prefect badge laid gently beside the note." As the wind rose again that night, Inspector Craddock sat by the fire, watching the rain streak the windows. "The pattern was there," he murmured. "In the shadows. We just didn't want to see it." Miss Marple said nothing, but in her eyes sorrow and understanding wove together, like a seam stitched tight. The truth had emerged, and it had worn the face of someone they'd all trusted. The candlelight flickered in the corners of Miss Marple's study as the village wind howled against the panes. Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth, the latest development still heavy in his hands. A signed confession by Agnes Weaver, found in the lining of her coat, recovered from the depot where Dora Carruthers had been abandoned. He stared into the flame, brow furrowed. "It still doesn't make sense. Why now? Why would she come after Lydia after all these years?" Miss Marple, seated with a shawl over her lap, tapped the folded confession thoughtfully. "Because Lydia uncovered something that Agnes couldn't let see daylight. Not just scandal, not abuse, something personal, something buried." Craddock turned. "You think there's more?" She gave him a long, solemn look. "I know there is." 3 days later, forensic analysts confirmed it. Emily Hargrove, the girl who had allegedly run away from the academy in 1949, had not simply vanished. Her remains had been found beneath the garden shed on Agnes Weaver's property, buried over 70 years ago, wrapped in the remnants of an academy bedsheet. Agnes had been a student then, barely 17. "She didn't kill her," Craddock said aloud, reading through the pathology report. There was no sign of trauma. Cause of death was likely an overdose. Barbiturates. "Which fits the profile," Miss Marple murmured. Emily was reportedly withdrawn, isolated. Some claimed unstable. But why bury her? Why hide it? Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Because Emily was her sister." Craddock looked up, stunned. "Her what?" The village records told the story. Agnes Weaver, born Agnes Hargrove, had changed her name at age 18 following the academy scandal. No one had questioned it. In those days, people vanished from the public eye easily, especially women with pasts they wished to erase. Miss Marple tapped the folder. Emily Hargrove was her younger sister by 2 years, sent to the academy when Agnes was already a prefect. Craddock shook his head. But why hide it? Why bury her under a shed and never speak of it again? Miss Marple's expression was grave. Because Agnes blamed herself? Agnes' full confession, tightly written, ink smudged in places, was not just a list of crimes. It was a window into a tortured soul. Emily came to the academy because father couldn't handle her. Mother had died the year before. I begged him not to send her. She was too soft for that place, but he wouldn't listen. Julian Hale saw her vulnerability like blood in water. He manipulated her, promised her kindness. She clung to him like a lifeline. I saw it happening, and I said nothing, because I was afraid of what it would mean for me, for our name. The night she died, she came to my room. She was sobbing, shaking, said Hale had threatened her if she told anyone, that she couldn't live like this anymore. She begged me to help her. I told her to go to bed and we'd speak in the morning. I was tired,
I didn't understand how close to the edge she truly was. In the morning, she was gone. Craddock read the final paragraph aloud. I buried her because I couldn't bear to see her judged. I couldn't bear myself, and when
The school closed, I stayed to watch, to atone, and then Lydia started asking questions, digging where no one was meant to dig. She wasn't after justice, she was after absolution, but I couldn't let her open those graves. Miss Marple's hands trembled as she folded the letter again. The motive wasn't rage or greed, it was guilt, twisted, consuming guilt. Craddock stared at the fireplace. She lived an entire life under that weight. And when Lydia threatened to unearth it, Miss Marple said, Agnes snapped. They visited Dora Carruthers later that day. She sat in the sunlit conservatory of the hospital, pale but recovering, hands clasped in her lap. I remember her whispering to me, Dora said, when I was tied up. She told me to stop asking questions, that some truths should stay buried. I didn't understand. Craddock nodded gently. She was trying to stop you from making the same mistake Lydia did. Dora blinked. So, she wasn't a monster? Miss Marple sighed. No, dear, she was a frightened girl who grew into a frightened woman. She made terrible choices, but monsters are born from cruelty. Agnes was shaped by grief. At the village cemetery, they finally laid Emily Hargrove to rest. A simple headstone, inscribed with her name and the year of her death. No fanfare. Just silence and a single white rose laid by Dora. Miss Marple stood beside Craddock as the breeze
rustled through the hedgerows. In the end, Craddock said softly, she didn't want to be remembered.
She wanted to be forgiven, Miss Marple replied, and perhaps, in this small act, she will be. That evening, as twilight sank over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple penned a letter to the Academy Trust, anonymously. She enclosed the full confession, the truth behind the deaths, and a request. Let this be the final chapter. Do not reopen the school. Do not raise monuments to shadows. Let the girls who suffered be remembered, and the ones who stayed silent never be forgotten. She signed it only with an initial. A week later, Craddock received word that Agnes Weaver's body had been found. She had drowned in the river just beyond the old Academy gate. No sign of struggle, just a small locket around her neck containing a photograph of two young girls, Agnes and Emily, smiling under a summer sky. Craddock didn't send for reporters. There was no arrest.
No charges, only closure. Back in her garden, Miss Marple pruned the rose bushes, pausing only when a robin fluttered past the sundial. She didn't smile, she didn't weep. She simply nodded, quietly acknowledging the storm that had passed. The village,
for all its charm, had been a vessel for secrets far darker than anyone imagined. And now, with truth unearthed and stories laid to rest, peace might finally return. For a while, rain lashed against the arched windows of the St. Mary Mead Library as Miss Marple sat across from Julian Hale. They were alone. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth. A pot of tea sat untouched on the tray between them. Julian's expression was calm. Too calm. Miss Marple's knitting needles were still in her
lap unmoving.
Her eyes were sharp, watching, waiting. She had invited him under the pretense of discussing Lydia's scholarship work, her unfinished legacy. But this was no friendly call. This was a reckoning 70 years in the making. Why now, Miss Marple? he asked finally, voice smooth. Why stir up old ghosts? She lifted her eyes. Because the dead deserve peace, and the living deserve justice. Julian chuckled, shifting slightly. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and placed a small object on the table. A locket. Same one found on Agnes Weaver's body. Julian's smile faded. She kept this for 70 years, Miss Marple said. The last memory she had of Emily. He said nothing. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. She blamed herself. But it wasn't her fault, was it? Julian's jaw tightened. Miss Marple pressed. Emily came to your office for help. You didn't turn her away, you pulled her deeper, promised her protection. Love. You used her vulnerability. Julian stood slowly. That's enough, but Miss Marple didn't flinch. You were already married, she said softly, and she was 17. You knew what you were doing, and when she tried to end it, when she told Agnes, you threatened her. Julian's hands clenched into fists. She overdosed the next night, Miss Marple continued.
Agnes thought it was suicide. But I've reviewed the pathology report. The dose wasn't self-administered. The angle of injection was wrong. A long silence. Then, for the first time, Julian Hale's mask cracked. Do you have any idea?
What that time was like, he hissed. Do you know what it meant to have ambition as a man in those days? Everything was appearances, reputation, one scandal, and it's all gone. Miss Marple's voice was ice. So, you killed her? I
protected myself, Julian snapped. She was going to destroy me. Over what? A childish infatuation.
She couldn't even tell the difference between love and gratitude. He stepped forward, looming over her. And now you think you'll take me down with a few whispers and a rusty locket? Miss Marple looked past him, to the doorway, where Inspector Craddock stepped in, notebook in hand, followed by Sergeant Ellis, recorder in pocket, tape already running. Julian froze. Craddock's voice was quiet. We've been here the whole time. Miss Marple rose from her chair. You once told Emily she'd be forgotten, that no one would care. She looked him in the eyes. You were wrong. The next hour passed in a blur of handcuffs, cautionary, statements, and silence. Julian Hale did not speak again. Not to Craddock. Not to Miss Marple. As the car drove him away from the village, the rain finally stopped. Miss Marple stood by the garden gate, watching the sky clear. In the police station's evidence room, Craddock reviewed the case, Agnes Weaver's confession, Dora Carruthers' testimony, the recovered injection kit buried with Emily, forensic confirmation of Hale's fingerprints on the vial, the locket, the recordings. The web had been vast, but now, at last, it was closed. 2 days later, Dora arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. She looked healthier, more grounded, a little less afraid of the world. Is it really over? She asked. Miss Marple poured her tea. For now. I never imagined Julian Hale. He was so elegant, charismatic. Predators often are. Dora looked down at her cup. What happens to people like that? Miss Marple was quiet. They build lives on secrets. Eventually, the weight of those lies becomes too great to bear. And when the truth comes knocking, they either crumble or they fight, Dora finished. Miss Marple nodded. And in doing so, they reveal exactly what they've always been. The trial moved quickly. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Julian Hale on charges of murder, historical abuse, and obstruction of justice. The weight of the evidence was too much, even for his expensive barristers. He was sentenced to life in prison. The press had a field day. Scholar turned killer.
Unmasked after 70 years.
But for the people of St. Mary Mead, the real story was quieter. It was the sigh of relief in the church pews, the old gardener who finally felt safe walking past the academy grounds. The forgotten names etched on a newly restored memorial in the chapel. Miss Marple stood before it now. A single marble plaque engraved with 14 names, including Emily Hargrove. Beneath it, a line in Latin, Veritas numquam perit. The truth never perishes. Dora placed a rose beside it. Miss Marple smiled. No more ghosts, she whispered. That evening Craddock joined her for supper. They sat in the parlour, firelight dancing on the walls. You knew he'd come, he said. Miss Marple nodded. People like Julian always return to the scene of the crime, especially when they believe they're still in control. You played him perfectly. She shook her head. I simply waited. Sometimes truth is a patient thing. He leaned back. So, what will you do now? Miss Marple looked at the fading sunlight outside. There's a puzzle in every village, Inspector, and a little light still left to shine. She reached for her knitting needles. And perhaps, just this once, I'll finish a scarf before winter. The trial had ended. Julian Hale was behind bars, the jury unanimous in their verdict. The village of St. Mary Mead, cloaked in early autumn mist, breathed easier. And yet, beneath the surface calm, a current of unease still ran. Miss Marple felt it. She always trusted her instincts, and they were telling her that something didn't add up. The facts fit. The confession had been caught on tape. Motive, opportunity, physical evidence, all accounted for. But there was something in Hale's final expression, just before he was led from the courtroom. A smirk. Not anger, not defeat. Satisfaction. 1 week later, Miss Marple received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, aged, and slightly burned around the edges. It showed 2 young women at the gates of the St. Mary Mead Academy. One was clearly Emily Hargrove, the other was Dora Carruthers, but the date on the back made no sense. August 1952. 6 months after Emily was supposed to have died. It's impossible, Dora said when Miss Marple confronted her. That must be someone else. A mistake. Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. You knew her, didn't you? Longer than you claimed.